the job loss is very close to the worst since the 1930s in the current recession, and I don't think it's over yet by any means. I think the economy is stabilizing. We're on the verge of some kind of recovery, but it's going to be a very crappy one, and the job market is going to feel it last of all. You can see in the second chart, the one of employment there, that about this time in the average post-World War II recession, the heavy line, employment started taking off. It is still declining now. If anything, the decline accelerated earlier this year when it should have been flattening out. We also see the chart below that. The unemployment rate would also normally be rolling over and heading down at this point. What is it, 18, 19 months after the recession began. It is still creeping higher and likely to continue to do so into next year. One of the striking features of this recession has been a really sharp decline in consumption. The decline in retail sales depicted in the chart at the top of page 5 there is really remarkable. At the end of last year, the beginning of this year, retail sales declined by about 10%, the steepest on record. And they've since recovered somewhat, but this is not much of a recovery. And they were stimulated last month and the month before by the Cash for Clunkers program, which is now expired, and so has the auto market with it. The cash, just as an aside, since I don't have my co-panelists to talk about green jobs, the Cash for Clunkers program was partly financed by raiding research and development funds for clean energy. So, in order to create a very short-term stimulus that isn't even necessarily good for the environment, there's no evidence that the Cash for Clunkers program, even though old cars are replaced with new, more efficient ones, it's very dirty to make a car. So, if there's any payoff, environmental payoff from the Cash for Clunkers program, it will be felt for at least 5 years. So this is a very, very short-term stimulus program that's already expired, had no lasting effect, produced a brief bounce in manufacturing and then is now dissipating, and has no real ecological value, and was financed by raiding something that has ecological value and possible long-term growth potential as well, creating new forms of clean energy. So this is an example of stupid short-termism at its worst, which is obviously what the American political system does very well. One of the reasons that retail sales decline so dramatically is, as the next chart shows, a real sharp decline in consumer credit. Consumer credit, has been one of the wonders of the world since about the 1920s. And it just seems like a lot of households are really up to their ears in debt. I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but just want to make the point that we would normally see in a normal recession, growth in consumer credit just flattened out. It rarely went down. This time it is not really flattened out, it's heading down, and this is the time when it should be rising again, and it's not. So one of the crucial supports for mass consumption it just isn't working this time, and that's partly because of the disruption in the credit markets since the financial crisis broke out. But it's also because I think a lot of households realize that they're up to their ears in debt and are really cutting back on consumption. Now, people who obviously lost their jobs and have no money have no choice but to cut back on consumption. But even though 90% of people in the labor market do have jobs, and they're not spending, they're being very cautious, and this is a really remarkable economic, cultural, political change if it persists. We've also seen a very sharp decline in business spending on capital goods. That's the third graph on page 5 there. That is investment in machinery and equipment, which is those motor for long-term economic growth, long-term productivity growth. That has also declined rather sharply. It was never very high. It never got very high during the expansion between 2001 and 2007. Corporate profits were very high, but they did not invest those profits. They distributed them to their shareholders through dividends, through takeovers. The private equity guys loaded companies up with debt, extracted the money, and put it in their fat pockets. Unlike the expansion of the 1990s, in which we saw high levels of investment, strong productivity growth, income growth across the income distribution. We haven't seen any of those. We never saw none of those things in the 2001-2007 expansion. We saw very slow employment growth, the slowest employment growth of any of the 10 or 11 expansions since the end of World War II. We saw very low levels of investment, weakening productivity growth, and very, very lopsided growth in the income distribution. That is, people at the very, very top did very, very well. And when I say the very top, I mean not just the top 1%. I'm talking the top 1/10 of 1%, the top 1/100th of 1%. Something like, I think I've got this on the back page, yes. Oh no, that's the issue before that. The richest 30,000 households in the United States, top 1/100th of 1%, saw their incomes rise by about 25% between 2001 and 2007. Everyone else was flat or down. So it was, even the upper middle class didn't do so well between 2001 and 2007. It was really the plutocrats that did very well. The last graph of the page also shows that bank credit to businesses, which are really the bread and butter of day-to-day business, the things that finance inventory, things that finance payrolls and just basic operations of day-to-day business, have been contracting because, again, of the financial crisis and the seizure of the credit markets. So it is a very bad recession, and although some of the leading indicators, those that forecast moves in the economy several months out, are turning up, most of the rises come from the financial side, the stock market, interest rates, things like that. The labor market indicators, job market indicators are still quite poor. Really no sign of a bottom in those at all. So I think what they're telling us is that we're going to see a weak recovery as the year comes to an end and next year begins, but nothing that's going to feel like that. It's still going to feel like a recession to most people. There was a poll that came out the other day, I think it was ABC Washington Post, that reported that 82% of Americans think the recession is still underway. Wall Street thinks it's over, but it's hard to get 82% of Americans to agree on anything. But 82% agree that the recession is far from over. So how did we get to this pass? Now, obviously the most recent answer is the housing bubble and all the nonsense that went on around that. But I want to step back a bit into the 70s and talk about some of the longer-term developments in the underlying political economy that helps explain, I think, how we got to the situation we're in, which is not a pretty one. If we go back to the 1970s, it was the time of stagflation, rapid inflation, slow growth. Inflation to economists and most people means rising prices, a steady rise in the price level. But I think there's a political meaning to inflation as well. I think it was a sense of a loss of control by the elites of everything that was underway. We had lost the Vietnam War. There was a sense the United States was losing control of the global political system. People were talking about the end of the American century. A lot of jokes about the American century only lasted 30 years or whatever. There was a lot of labor militancy going on, some of it not formal. Some of the unions it was not being led necessarily by the unions, but it's just a lot on the job. A lot of people going off on their job and going off on their breaks and smoking pot and then sabotaging the line when they came back. It was the time when Take This Job and Shove It was at the top of the charts. There was just a general disrespect for authority, a sense that the populace was in a bad mood, and that was true of the United States, domestically, but also internationally. The Third World was in rebellion, demands for a new world economic order, redistribution. OPEC had done two successful oil embargoes that jacked up the price of oil. There was, of course, the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran. There was just a sense that things are out of control and that the normal hierarchies were being overturned. So I think that's another dimension to the term inflation, that certainly rising price levels of the sort that we saw in the 70s were extremely unprecedented. Most of the inflations we saw in American history were during wartime. It was very unusual to see that kind of really sustained rise in the price level over the course of a decade or so. So there was something had gone awry. And the American ruling class really had enough by the end of the decade and decided it was time for a crackdown. There's a very interesting book by Sidney Blumenthal called The Rise of the Counter-Establishment about how the right wing came to power in the late 70s. One of the points he makes is that it wasn't rising out of the business class. Business people were just doing their normal thing. they had a bunch of intellectuals who were telling them that they needed to adopt a different political strategy. A lot of people at think tanks and stuff. Walter Wriston, who was the chair of Citibank in the 70s, told Blumenthal that he was very skeptical at first about Ronald Reagan. It took him a while to come around to embracing Reagan. So it was, in some sense, the intellectuals and the political class that pushed the crackdown agenda. It really didn't emerge necessarily out of the capitalist class, because they can't always think for themselves. They have to hire people to think for them. But in any case, what happened in 1979, October 1979, Paul Volcker came in at the Federal Reserve. There had been a dollar crisis, rose the dollar, and Wall Street had told Jimmy Carter it was time to do something about it. Jimmy Carter did what David Rockefeller told him and appointed Paul Volcker to be chair of the Federal Reserve. Volcker took office and promptly said the American standard of living must decline, and that's actually said that in congressional testimony, and drove up interest rates towards 20% and created the deepest recession since since the 1930s. It was deliberately provoked. The point of it was to break that bad attitude, to discipline the working class, to scare people into behaving, and it was a very, very successful maneuver. That was then reinforced at the political level when Reagan took office in 1981, fired Patco, broke a bunch of unions, cut social spending, and there was really no fight back. There was a class war from above that was barely resisted and was very, very successful. But there was a contradiction in it, as there always is, and that is that you can't have an economy or a culture that is, or a political system that is legitimated by high levels of mass consumption successfully reproduce itself. At the same time, mass purchasing power is under. You can't have people buy stuff when they're cutting their wages. So the solution that the system came up with, cleverly, to continue to consume. And conveniently, as income was being redistributed upwards, there was plenty of at the top of the ladder to lend to people in the middle and lower rung. So we saw in the 80s and into the 90s, people used their credit cards very aggressively. Then as the 90s turned into the 2000s, the mortgage market became the center of borrowing. It wasn't just, people weren't just using mortgages to buy houses. They were also using mortgages to consume. What economists call mortgage equity withdrawal, the cash that was taken out of the housing market either by borrowing against the rising value of housing, or cash was taken out when you sell a house and buy one of lower value, if anybody actually did that. That totaled somewhere between $3 to $5 trillion during the housing bubble, a massive amount of money even by standards of the American economy. So, it's a tremendous amount of borrowing that was used to consume. Some of that consumption was flat screen TVs and lawn chairs, but some of that consumption, a lot of that consumption actually, was healthcare spending. A very large portion of the growth in consumption over the last couple of decades has been spent on healthcare, and that's just pure inflation. So there is a kind of moralizing line that says Americans overconsume and need to tighten their belts. They overconsume relative to their incomes, but what they're spending money on isn't necessarily gadgets. A lot of it is just trying to keep up with the rising cost of healthcare. But in any case, American households saw themselves rising debt burdens, and while the bubble was expanding, it didn't matter. People would just refinance the mortgage, take some more cash out, pay off some old loans, and get some new ones. And so that all obviously came to a very bad end, starting in 2006 into 2007, when the housing market started losing air. But remember, this whole aggressive use of borrowing was a solution to that problem. The weakness in wage growth, weakness in household income growth was resolved by, or at least mitigated, through heavy borrowing, the Visa card, and the home equity line of credit. About a third of the growth in consumption during the 2001-2007 period was housing related. The job market, as I said, was very weak. Wage growth was very weak. So it was only the froth of the housing market that allowed the thing to go on at all. So now that's all come to a very bad end. And I think it's not, when we look at this recession, I think it's a real structural crisis in the sense that that whole model of jacking up corporate profits by cutting wages, cutting welfare spending, and scaring the hell out of the working class and then lending people the money to make up the gap in their expected levels of consumption. That's broken, and I don't think it can be repaired. So, the question going forward is what is going to replace this model? The American elite is not going to accept a high wage model of they're not easily going to say that we need to raise wages so people can buy more things. That's the last thing they want to do. We have a government now that seems to be perfectly happy to spend trillions of dollars trying to restore the status quo before 2007 in the financial markets. And Wall Street is doing very, very well, paying itself very handsomely. But there's been no serious re-regulation of finance. There's been no serious addressing of these toxic and pathological structures of the financial system. And certainly no effort to address the maldistribution of income and all the problems that's created. So if you look at this, I think, you look at this, you're going to have a very serious structural problem with a whole model that just isn't going to work in the coming years. And if you then look at what, the IMF has done some very interesting work over the last year, looking at what happens in real economies after financial crises. And they've looked at a number of these, about 40 of them since 1970. And what they found is that the recessions that follow financial crises are very deep and very long. And a lot of the job growth, income, or the job loss and income loss that happens in those sorts of recessions is essentially never recovered. It's just gone forever. It's not a normal recession that we've seen many times since the end of World War II, where things fall down and then pick back up and just go back on an expansionary path. The IMF, which is not known for revolutionary outlook or its particularly gloomy attitude towards capitalism, says that these post-financial crisis recessions do not go back to the status quo before. It's not back to business as usual after they're over. So they take a really long time to heal. And I think we're experiencing, obviously, something very much like that. So this is what comes after the financial crisis, to return to the title of this session. I think what we're seeing is a very weak recovery and something that's going to feel to most people like a recession. Now, what I wanted to do is pass it along to someone who would then tell us what the green economy can do for us. And he's not here; he's in another session. So I will then just imitate him or impersonate him for a moment and say that one of the very serious problems with the American economy at this point is that we have no leading sector, no dynamic sector that could drive growth for a decade or two or three. If we look back in American economic history, in the 19th century, late 19th century, we had industrialization, creation of a transcontinental railroad system, created steel, demand for steel, locomotives. That development of the railroad then created development, very brutal, obviously, but created development across what white folks thought of as wilderness. And if you look back in the early 20th century, 1920s, the boom of the 1920s, radio, automobiles, the post-World War II boom, suburbanization, the car, the universalization of mass consumption in the 50s and 60s. There's nothing like that now. It looked for a while like tech might do that in the 1990s. That didn't last very long. It was kind of just a lot of that was froth. So here we are now with, I think, no leading sector to help us to get out of this mess. I think we could have a leading sector of that sort in the form of green technologies, clean energy development, just redoing our transportation infrastructure, redoing all our buildings. We're getting small degrees of that. I mean, the stimulus bill that passed Congress right after Obama took office had very small amounts of money and some rhetoric, but not very much money committed to that agenda. And it would take a very aggressive activity by the state to make that happen. Capitalists are not going to do it spontaneously. They're not very good at really radical new technologies. They need the state to knock heads together and provide subsidies. computer. Ideologues love to celebrate the computer as a creation of entrepreneurship. It was created by the Pentagon, basically. In the 50s and 60s, computers were subsidized very, very heavily. Private industry was not terribly interested in it until all the basic development was done, and then they could then turn them into profitable products. The internet, very similar story. Private industry is not into that. The Pentagon subsidized that. A lot of biotechnology, also very heavily subsidized by the federal government. If you look at the areas where the United States is still economically competitive on a global scale, it is in computers, related technologies, aerospace, airplanes, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, all these things in which the government has a very heavy presence. So if we want to get any kind of real longer-term boom going off green technologies and actually save life on Earth in the process, then it's going to take a much more activist state than our political system seems capable of generating at this point. So I think we desperately need that sort of thing, both to preserve life on Earth and to create some sort of long-term economic, sustainable economic expansion. But it just doesn't seem that we're politically capable of it. So until something along those lines changes, we're, I think, in for pretty rough economic times. And anybody who's read my stuff or listened to me over the years knows that I'm not, by nature, a catastrophist. I was rejected most talk of crisis and disaster scenarios, but I think we've really got a very serious problem on our hands, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. And it's going to take a very different political environment to change that fact. Any comments, questions? I haven't actually been in an early meeting in some time, but there used to be a rule where you couldn't call a white guy twice in a row. So
it's still there.
It's still there.
Carry on.
I'm going to go me for a second. All right. Okay, who wants to go first? All right, we'll start with someone who's not a white guy. Yes.
On the second page, this has to do with the money supply in U.S. dollar indices. There's a lot of talk in the right-wing press also, but in general about the decline in the U.S. dollar and that perhaps oil will no longer be traded in that in the future. Do you think that's do you think that's nonsense? Do you think it's just paranoia, or do you think there might be something real behind that?
I think of two things about that. One is that there's some truth to it. The American economy is less and less dominant in the world. There are a lot more rivals. There's a lot more dynamism elsewhere. Look at China. It's still a poor country, but everyone thought that this economic crisis was going to lead China to hit a wall and fall apart. It's not. Maybe it will, but right now it's remarkable how resilient it's been in the face of the loss of its export market here. So in that sense, the dollar is going to face a declining role in the world, just as the U.S. economy and imperial power also erode. But I think the right wing is really taking advantage of that. And they're using it, just purely partisan Republican reasons, beating up on Obama and saying that the massive deficit we're running, partly just a reflection of the economic crisis, but also as part of the stimulus and rescue bills. They want to cut back on that, balance the budget, and go back to classic orthodox fiscal policy. Had that pointed to weakness of the dollar as and screaming about that as alarm bells. Actually, if you look at a chart of the dollar, what happened was that it was pretty weak in 2007, strengthened in 2008 as the economic crisis deepened, because the traditional role of the United States is a haven for capital around the world. Whenever capital is nervous, it comes to the United States, because for all the problems we have here, there's no safer place for capital. Nobody's going to get expropriated here, as far as we know. You're going to get subsidized, not expropriated. So the political system is so quiescent. I just read a piece for the new issue of my newsletter about the household income and poverty in 2008. Household income's down really hard in 2008, and that was before the worst of the recession hit. Poverty up rather sharply. And if you extrapolate what is likely we'll learn next September when the 2009 numbers come out, it's probably much worse. we have fewer people employed now than we did in April 2000. That's never happened in the United States. We've never had employment contract over a period of 9 years. It might have happened in the 1930s. We don't have good enough numbers to say that, but it's very it's extraordinary that average Americans are experiencing such a long-term downward mobility, and they're not protesting. They're just taking it. And the only people out in the streets are the lunatics with tea bags in our heads who think that we're experiencing creeping socialism. I wish we were, but we're not. So that's the only kind of visible dissent there is. That may change in a year or two. I don't know. But right now, capital seems very safe in the United States. So the decline of the dollar over the last few months has really just reversed, partly reversed, not even fully reversed, that increase in 2008, that fear-induced rise. So I think Ken Rogoff, who was formerly the chief economist of the IMF, and is now back at Harvard, said that maybe the problems of the dollar and U.S. fiscal problems are going to bring forward the day when the dollar is no longer dominant in the world. Even though that might reduce the time from 75 years to 40. Maybe he's being complacent, but I think we're talking about a really, really long-term evolution and not something that's necessarily panic about right now. And in some sense, a declining dollar isn't necessarily a bad thing. It makes U.S. exports more competitive in world markets, makes imports less appealing, so it makes domestic production more attractive. So there's something to be said for a moderately declining dollar. If you have a rout in the dollar, interest rates spike, the Treasury has a hard time selling its $1 trillion of debt, then that's a real problem. But until that happens, I think it's mainly right-wing hysteria. Yeah.
If we were to be incredibly optimistic and in terms of hopefulness about real and meaningful healthcare reform, do you think there might be a possibility, because of the tremendous demand that would generate for healthcare providers and support the healthcare professions and support persons in healthcare, that the demand for workers in that field might be something that over the long run might be a source that could generate or stimulate economic growth? I mean, we're really talking about long-term, not overnight.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Healthcare is one of the few areas that actually still is adding jobs. So, and even during the expansion, the 2001, 2007, when many other sectors were barely adding anything, healthcare was very, very strong. There was a period, I don't know, 2006, 2007, I think it was, when the two strongest sectors in the economy were healthcare and bars and restaurants. So I like to think, people are eating and drinking too much, then checking into the hospital to cure their alienation and then cure their livers. But you could argue that we spend too much on healthcare. And that's part of the reason we need healthcare reform. And that if we spend less on healthcare, we can spend money on something else. So I don't think that meaningful healthcare reform's outcome would be creating necessarily more employment in the sector. It would be redistributing the kind of employment there is. There's this overemphasis on specialization, not enough on basic care, and all that sort of thing. So we hospitalize too many people and don't give routine care to enough. So I don't think that the outcome of healthcare reform would necessarily be more employment in that sector. It would be freeing up some money that we spend. I think it's 70% more than the next country as a percentage of GDP. I think the second highest spender on healthcare is France, and we spend 70% more than they do as a share of GDP. So that's, and we have terrible numbers on health and longevity and infant mortality and all sorts of things. So we're spending enormous amounts of money and getting very little in return. I think we need to rejigger all that. And it's not just a qualitative thing. It's not a quantitative thing. It's a qualitative thing. David?
I agree with your expectation that this is likely to be a long-lasting problem, that the set of institutions we've had that did promote some kind of growth and high profits aren't going to work anymore the way they have. But if that's true, then that suggests that if all that happens is attempts to patch up a system that can't be patched up, it suggests there's going to be continuing stagnation for some time. And isn't that likely to have isn't it likely over time to change the, what's politically possible?
Yeah, I think it's likely to change what's politically possible. Sometimes I despair of the American mind. God knows who they're going to blame for it and what solution they're likely to come up with. I go two ways on the fact that we have Barack Obama in the White House right now. I think he has demobilized a lot of people who would normally, the nature of politics, I wouldn't say on the far left, but the liberal left or wherever you want to locate it, was so focused on the demonization of George Bush for so many years, and Dick Cheney. You turn on MSNBC and they can't let go. And like Sarah Palin's not a gift to these people because they can continue to obsess. And God knows the American right is really, truly crazy. So there's a lot of material to work with. But there's this great void about what to do about it. It's just too easy to kick around George Bush and Sarah Palin and Dick Cheney. And I like jokes about Dick Cheney's man-sized Satan as the next guy, but that he could only do so much of that. So there are a lot of people who just sort of hung back and are filled with illusions about what Obama is all about. It operates on the right too, well, here's this guy. He's obviously conversant of the left. I mean, he actually, he's a very sophisticated guy, very smart fellow. He obviously has very deep understanding of politics. He spent some time on the left. He writes in one of his books about going to socialist scholars conferences. He may have played down his association with Bill Ayers, but there's something going on there. This guy, I think he left that all behind. Maybe he saw it as a way to rise in Chicago politics, and then once that was usefulness that had passed, he decided to jettison it. But this guy is very sophisticated. He's not George Bush. And he knows how to use the language. And somebody once said of Jerry Brown is that one of Jerry Brown's great secrets of success in politics was that he was a blank screen that people could project whatever they wanted to onto him. People do an awful lot of projection onto Obama as well. People on the liberal left are saying, he's one of us. Just wait, he'll reveal his inner progressive is going to pop out at some point, whatever that might be. And then people on the right think, he's a raving socialist, and the fact that Van Jones, for example, was indeed a revolutionary Maoist at some point in this past before he discovered the beauties of green capitalism. There's some material that people can work with, but basically it's pure fantasy that this is somehow a progressive regime that's in the White House. So I have great hope that maybe disillusionment with that will set in, and good things can happen as a result of that. I often quote Gary Will's explanation of why the 60s happened, which is that during the 50s, people said it's all Eisenhower's fault. Everything, once we get our guy in there, everything will get better. Kennedy got in there, and you still had inequality and imperial war and all kinds of terrible things. And then people said, oh, yeah, I guess the system really does suck after all. So that is what led to a radicalization of a lot of the populace in the 60s. I hope something like that might happen again. And I think that partly explains why we saw the growth of the movement that culminated in Seattle in the late 90s, which is that disillusionment with a Democrat in office. And that makes people look further to the left. I think it's going to take some time for that to happen, but that is something encouraging. And there is the possibility that, let's say, Obama is a very smart, sophisticated guy, and if things persist in sucking, then he might be a little more flexible about moving somewhat to the left and doing some of the things I was talking about. But right now it seems like Wall Street is dominating economic policy. They don't want to do anything that's going to harm Wall Street. And the narrowness of that political base is truly amazing. I mean, it's a very small subset of the American capitalist class even that's really prospering. But they really do have a lock on government at this point, it seems. So I do hope that disillusionment will be productive, but it may take some time to get there. Okay, we need someone who's not a white guy. Yes.
Hi, can you comment on the economic growth? And I know there's a lot of toxicity in GDP, a lot of bad activities, but in European democracies versus like fake democracies versus authoritarian societies like Singapore in the context of the Electoral College and its distortion of one person, one vote? I know that's quite a mouthful.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Like,
Are we more like Singapore?
are we more like
Because the
Singapore
Electoral
or Europe, and does the Electoral College play a role, I guess, to try to simplify?
I guess the Electoral College does play some role. I'm more obsessed with the rottenness and evilness of the Senate right now. But,
Yes.
similar idea, though. It gives an outsized influence to small states. And I was just adding up the numbers. The 6 guys, the 6 5 men and 1 woman, the 6 people who are around the table in the Finance Committee shaping the healthcare legislation, together represent 3% of the U.S. population. Their states do, and since they're only half of the senatorial delegation, I guess they represent 1.5% of the U.S. population. 3 of them, from the 3 smallest states, have a smaller combined population than Brooklyn. So, there's just really weird political system in which Brooklyn is outvoted by, these centrist Democrats and Republicans from the sticks. It's just really, it's fundamentally very, very democratic. Now, Singapore has a more equal distribution of income in the United States. They have been able to deliver more consistent economic growth. I have to admit, I sometimes envy the Chinese, their great power to run an economy and plan intelligently. Obviously, it's also a very brutal system, but they have been able to deliver some payoff. It's just been very rapid growth in the average standard of living of most Chinese people. And there's an awful lot of exploitation, hideousness, and brutality there, but they're also, there's something to be learned from them as well. And we can't stand, the Earth can't stand the rate at which they're adding coal-fired power plants every day, but they are doing a reasonably good job of running their economy from purely capitalist principles. It's not a socialist paradise by any means, but we can't do anything. We don't have democracy. We now don't even have an economy that's delivering any level of prosperity. The American way just looks really kind of rotten now. So there was a time, back in the 70s, I did some research in Sweden 15 years ago. I read some old stuff from the 70s when it was very popular on the radical left. The autonomists, the anarchists were complaining about how boring social democracy is. And I feel like now I could do with that kind of boredom. The United States is not a boring place, I have to admit that, but it's very ugly and brutal very often.
It's understandable that the mainstream media and politicians would describe the current situation as a recovery, even though they're sometimes forced to refer to it as a jobless recovery. But when 82%, according to your figure, of the people say we're still in a depression, I wonder if we should insist on the word depression, and if we want to use the word recovery, it should be as a qualification that some people who are still making money, usually because of the help of their government, are doing well, and insist on this being a depression. I think too much is, one biases the way people are going to understand the situation if one starts by there being some kind of recovery, which is moving forward in some areas, and of course there's still problems, rather than the reverse. I just wonder whether that is the way we on the left should always talk about it. Which also makes, by the way, when we talk about the future, not a search for how ways in which things might get better when we think they won't, but rather how much worse they're going to get, in what ways and how quickly, as being what the bulk of the talk about the near future should focus on.
Well, this isn't really a depression yet. In 1932, 25% of the the unemployment rate was 25%. It's now just under 10. So we have a long way to go. Well, yeah, but we're comparing basically the same definition now and then. The broader definition of the unemployment rate, yes, is about 17% now. But if you did that in 1932, you'd probably get a similar proportion. So you want to compare apples and apples. The government is just, as too big, and there's just too much stimulus going on, at least for now, to have that kind of 29 to 32 collapse. So I don't think calling this a depression is really accurate. If the crazy hawks get their way and we start seeing budget balancing and the Fed start tightening and all this sort of thing, there are a lot of people on Wall Street and even within the Federal Reserve System, most of the regional bank presidents who tend to be more conservative than the guys in Washington, but they're talking about the need for an exit strategy from all this stimulus. They're worried about inflation. Worrying about inflation now is just deeply demented. But there are some people who are talking that way. If we remove that stimulus, then God knows things could fall apart rather badly. But I think using the word recession is misleading in the sense that recession is a cyclical thing. It lasts 11 months on average and is recovered from in half a year or a year. We're not one of those. This is very long, and we're not going to recover very nicely from it for perhaps several years at least. So it's a real structural crisis. There's something very badly broken, and in a sense, it is a depression. I think in the sense that if you go back to what Keynes was talking about, you get an equilibrium at a very low level of activity. You just sort of stay at this point of high unemployment and low growth and a lot of fiscal and social strain. You could stay there for a very long time. There's nothing that's spontaneously going to generate a recovery to get back to a higher level of growth and a higher level of employment. And that is one of the points the IMF's work too about these post-crisis recessions. They just instead of that kind of classic V shape, they have in the economic textbooks, it's a long fall and just a very slow rise, and that gap, if you just extrapolate what growth would have been, and you have that fall off, that gap isn't closed, maybe ever. So I guess we don't really have a political vocabulary to talk about this right now, and certainly there's some sense at the elite level that something is very badly wrong. So they're not all people are completely ignorant of that, but you turn on the TV and you don't really get much of a sense that we have a structural crisis in our political economy, but that's really what we have.
I was more concerned with the label, less concerned with the label than with the process, which direction the main process is affecting the great majority of the people who are going. I'm suggesting that from what you say and point out, they're going down. And whether we should look for ways to deal with that first and then qualify it if we must with the fact that some people are affected by processes which are going up, like in terms of the bonuses and things of that sort.
Yeah.
Rather than the reverse, which gives the sense that we make people real optimistic when they should be pessimistic and more angry.
Yeah.
And looking for solutions to that.
Yeah, well, no, the process is not good. I mean, it's really a very serious structural problem, and it's going to feel bad for most people for quite a while. And Americans are almost it's almost a requirement for living here that you're supposed to be an optimist. So there's this natural cheerfulness, and then there's also this natural tendency of people to blame themselves for their problems. It's just need a better resume or better networking techniques, or reinvent yourself, come up with wittier Twitter birthdays, whatever. But that's just not happening. It's going to take. Richard Hofstadter has an argument somewhere that the long New Deal, if we think from the 1930s into the 1960s, before the rebellion against the New Deal really got underway, was a very anomalous period in American history, in which there was actually a vocabulary and a set of institutions that were more collectivist and more state-centered than anything we've seen before and since. So that was a period of aberration that lasted roughly 3 decades, in which there's a revision of classic American thinking. If you look back at the populists in the late 19th century, many of them were just like small business, petty bourgeois people who hated monopolies but had no problem with capitalism. The period of that long New Deal was a period when you had much more state-centered and collectivist ideas that had really entered the mainstream. And you had Eisenhower say in the 50s that you just couldn't repeal any of the stuff that the New Deal had produced, and you wouldn't want to. Only lunatics would go after Social Security. Now, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see serious attacks on Social Security in the coming years, coming out of the Democratic administration. I think Monica Lewinsky saved Social Security back in the Clinton years. And since Barack Obama seems like a very faithful man, there's probably no Monica Lewinsky in our immediate future, so we have to hope for something else to save Social Security. As a parenthetical statement, the economic record of presidents who were adulterous in office is far better than the economic record of presidents who are faithful to their spouses. So it all looks like, yeah, Obama's not an adulterer, so we're in trouble. Yeah.
How would you interpret the fact that in this recession or depression, whatever you want to call it, we now have more than 30 million people who are either officially unemployed or part-time unemployed or have dropped out of the labor force and would work, according to the BLS's own figures. And there's absolute passivity on the part of Obama, on the part of the left, on the part of everyone. It's like unemployment has always been an issue, almost a defining issue in terms of recession, even though it's not, the critical ones used in the measurement. But what's your feeling about what's causing this?
Are you finished? Were you finished the question? Oh, well, actually, employment is one of the indicators that the National Bureau of Economic Research uses to measure business cycles. So they don't measure unemployment, but they measure the employment level. And what's been going on with employment is truly remarkable. As I said before, we've seen global employment now is lower than it was in 2000, which is just unprecedented in modern American history. It's very, very strange. For most of capitalist history, we've seen more and more people absorbed into the paid labor market. A larger and larger portion of the population working for pay. That has now gone into reverse too. We now have the so-called employment population ratio, the share of the population that's employed, is the lowest. It's back at 1983 levels. So we saw a big rise in the 80s and the 90s, mainly because women entering the workforce. That has now gone into reverse. So we have a very serious employment problem. Something is wrong. We had, during the expansion 2001, 2007, very weak employment growth, weakest of any of the 10 expansions since World War II. So something is wrong with the American job market. And now with the recession, companies have laid off people like, it's not just laying off. And actually the rate of job loss in the recession has not been particularly high. What's very unusual about the recent period is that the rate of new hiring is very, very low. Employers are on a hiring strike. They're not hiring anybody at all. And that was true during the expansion as well. And that, I think, was because Wall Street had corporate America under tremendous pressure to maintain profits and maintain the flow of cash to stockholders. And spending money on things like capital equipment and employees was considered a waste of money by the gods of Wall Street. So that's one of the things that was at work. And we also have a very serious contraction underway, so that means employers are shedding or not hiring. So there is a very serious structural issue with the job market. And I guess where you're going is that we need some sort of jobs program in the United States. And it's just remarkable that there's no respectable political figure, even the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, that would even think of suggesting some kind of large-scale jobs program. That went out of style with the seeded program in the 1970s, and we haven't seen anything like that since. And we have basically no welfare state. The only anti-poverty program we have, the right wing likes to say, is a job. And so there's so few jobs around, poverty is winning. So I think we need some sort of jobs program. God knows there's plenty of work to do. Child care, rebuilding the infrastructure, creating, retrofitting buildings to be more energy efficient. It's not, the classic example of people digging holes and filling them up again. There's plenty of very useful things we could do, and the government has the means to do it, but there's no serious political movement demanding it, and no one's seriously, respectable positions even bringing up the subject. So maybe that's one of the things that if we have a sustained employment crisis, I think it's likely in the next couple of years, maybe that's going to change and people are going to start talking about demanding government jobs programs. But man, it's not happening right now. It's sad that there's just one of those things that you can't talk about and be taken seriously in the establishment. It's like, everyone knows that Social Security is going broke. It isn't really, but everyone knows that it is. And if you try to say it isn't, people think you're like a black helicopter guy. Okay, one more. Does it almost 5:30? Yeah.
Yeah, just the one word you haven't mentioned is military and security. And I wonder, isn't that one of the leading sectors of our economy? And isn't that a great potential? I mean, what do you think if we have an oligarchy, fascistic system, what will the economy look like after that? If we do have wars with Iran, Pakistan, and Colombia against Venezuela, what will that do to the U.S. economy, say, in 10 years from now?
Well, we already have something like that. We've got 2 wars underway, and the peace candidate seems to be escalating one and retaining and sustaining the other. So, I mean, that does sort of describe what the U.S. has been like in the last, really, since the end of World War II, a permanent war economy. So there's nothing new about it. One thing that's changed is that military spending has lost its economically stimulative effect. The kinds of stuff the military spends money on now is very arcane R&D and contracting for support services. That doesn't really create the kind of positive economic effects. I hate to think of spending money on weapons as having any kind of positive effect, but a lot of computer technology was a byproduct of Pentagon spending. There's nothing like that now. There's nothing of any civilian use coming out of the current kinds of military spending. Joe Stiglitz and Linda Bildes, I'm not sure if you pronounce it, did that book on the $3 trillion war. Their estimate is the war in Iraq. It's going to cost, when you add in the debt service and the human costs to disabled soldiers, the increase in the price of oil. When you add up the bill for the Iraq war, it's going to cost between $3 and $5 trillion. It's just an enormous waste of money. It provides nothing of any good economic effect. And haven't even been able, the American oil companies haven't been able to take over Iraqi oil. So, the cynical explanation of the war is that ExxonMobil wanted to get Iraqi oil reserves. Well, it hasn't happened yet. The Iraqi government is not being quite as pliable as Dick Cheney fantasized a few years ago. So we're wasting enormous amounts of money on killing and hurting people, and with nothing good you can say about it. I don't know. Is it going to get worse if the economy stays bad? Does it make us more bellicose? It could.
Isn't that a solution the way it was World War II for the Depression in some way?
Well, yeah, it was, but even if we were to invade Iran, it wouldn't provide anything on the scale of World War II. World War II did create an enormous employment effect and got us out of the Depression and all that. The Iraq War hasn't certainly not done that. If we do another war, I didn't want to think about what a war with Iran would look like. It would be hideous. But I don't think it would have any kind of great economic gain at all. In many ways, the United States looks like the British Empire did as it was coming to an end. One of the things the British did was, after a humiliating defeat in Southern Africa before a war, they went on to get involved in Afghanistan. So you could say the United States is somewhat following in their footsteps. Maybe there's a good reason why Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires. I just hope that we could get some kind of popular movement that we can come back to our senses. But, given American history and the present state of the American landscape, that doesn't seem at the top of the list right now. All right, I think I'll end on that note.